Hello, everyone. I think we can start now. I'd like to welcome you, first of all, on behalf of Fenners Chambers and the Local Family Justice Board, to our first webinar of 2024. And it's going to be on the assessment of parents with learning difficulties and disabilities. And we have Mary Baginsky, who is a reader in social care at King's College London. She's been doing some research on supporting parents with learning disabilities in care proceedings. And I know she's going to start off by telling us the difference between learning difficulties and learning disability, because we all use the terms rather loosely, I think. We're then going to hear from Sarah Seekins, Seekins, I mispronounced that, who's an independent social worker. And she's going to be talking about the different types of assessment models for parents with learning difficulties and disabilities. And in particular, it's going to focus on PAMS and I think the move now towards a different model, which is Parent Assess. So we'll be explaining the difference to us. And we have Ronald Judge Gordon Saker, our DFJ, who will then be rounding off the webinar. As usual, please do send questions and comments in through the Q&A and the chat function on your laptop or your iPad, and we'll do our best to answer the questions. If there are a lot, it might not be possible, and hopefully we'll be able to answer them in writing later. The webinar is being recorded as usual. We will be sending out the recording and the PowerPoint presentations. There'll be a bit of a delay this time round as Mary is still completing her research and it needs to be formally submitted and approved before it's sent out. So we're probably looking at early spring. So thank you very much for coming, everyone. If I could now hand over to Mary Baginsky.
Okay, hello everybody. I'm Mary Baginsky, and as Deborah said, I'm from King's College London. Most of my work has been on children and families, policy orientated and child protection. This project was funded by NIHR, and there was an opportunity to actually link with work of my colleagues. Most of the people working in my unit look at adult social care. So for once I was moving into their world. And it was also moving into a world I knew very little about, which was parents with learning disabilities. And as I'll come on to, I think actually there was an advantage about not knowing very much, because then I could be surprised by what I found. I'm just going to try and move this over a little bit. Just as some background, and I'm going to have to move fairly quick because I want to share as much as I can with you this afternoon. Public Health England has claimed about this hidden majority, invisible population of people with learning disabilities, saying that 77% of people with learning disabilities are not known to social care, and in fact often not known to any agencies. There's a general absence of reliable data around this area completely. And going back to what Deborah said, I am focused entirely, this work is focused entirely on parents with learning disabilities. So meaning that they would, in theory, qualify for support from adult social care. A learning difficulty, such as dyslexia or a range of other difficulties, would not. So the focus of my research, although it's gone much broader than that, has looked at the support that parents with learning disabilities would receive from adult social care, essentially when their children were removed following care proceedings. But in order to look at that in more detail, I needed to look at where adult social care was fitting into this whole picture anyway. And early on, I was told that, in fact, there were protocols for parents with learning disabilities which crossed adult services and children's services, and maybe learning disability teams as well. These things about protocols for parents are referred to in working together, but not specifically about parents with learning disabilities. And working together is the one thing that guides agencies working together on safeguarding children. So I assumed I would find these protocols, and I'll come back to how many authorities I was working with, but actually I found very few. There's also a background, which many of you will know about, is the good practice guidance. And that's good practice guidance on working with parents with learning disabilities for children's social care and adult social care. Odd origins, and not, although it has on the front the Department of Health and the Department for Education and Skills on the logo, those departments disappeared. The Department for Education and Skills disappeared the same year as the good practice guidance came into existence, and the Department of Health became the Department of Health and Social Care sometime around 2016. So you've already got a good practice guidance, which was introduced first in 2007. It was updated in 2016, but only really updating reference to policies, and then updated again in 2018. But the logos on the front refer to government departments that no longer exist. Similarly, there are very few references, and it's not in line with the Care Act 2014, which really dictates the provision of services across adult social care. It mentions the common assessment framework, but not the framework for the assessment of children in need and their families, which should be the staple assessment process used by children's social care. So there's this disconnect straight away, and the importance of that I'll come back to towards the end. But certainly around court cases, this good practice guidance has been cited, and local authorities have been condemned is probably a strong word, but they've been criticised for not using it. But I think there are a number of reasons why it isn't used. And also you have to remember that this research has been done in the context of local authorities' budgets being under severe constraints and resources in general. So to some extent, between adult social care and children's social care, it's like throwing around a hot potato. Who's going to pick up the cost for things? Just to give some idea, without labouring too much, how I did the work. I mean, I was very conscious that there's a lot of intersectionality with mental health and with substance misuse, but to get anywhere, I had to prioritise learning disability, well aware that some of those other factors could be in the lives of parents. I did a literature review. All good researchers do a literature review, and at some point I will publish it. And then I spent a long time talking to a lot of people with an interest in the area across social care, health, law, advocacy. And then a random sample of 22 local authorities across England, really at that point talking to people in adult social care about their understanding of their responsibilities in relation to parents with learning disabilities. And from those 22, I identified 8, either because they said something that was interesting, there was an indication that there might be good practice, or they knew absolutely nothing. I also wanted to reflect that as well. So there were 8 case studies which went on for a good part of last year. We did interview a few parents. It has taken a very, very minor part in this research. And there's a lot of studies which have looked at the views of parents, but this is far more orientated towards what's going on in local authorities and what could be made to work better. There were challenges, as you can imagine, trying to recruit adult social care and children's social care in the same authority, and to get a commitment from both was a challenge and not something I would want to repeat in a hurry. In some areas, adult social care engaged very well, in others, children's social care, and in some areas they both engaged brilliantly, but it was a matter of keeping digging until I arrived at the right people. Awareness of the project, who you link with, whether they remember to disseminate the information, it was all a challenge. And then inspections. We've known about Ofsted and children's social care. CQC came along for adult social care, through adult social care into a complete TIS, and that really was a constraint on reaching some of the people I wanted to speak to. Very quickly, the statutory responsibility under the Care Act is to ensure parents who have a disability are supported in their caring role. But to get through to adult social care, the IQ testing was still a strong determinant. A colleague of mine who worked in social care for many years said, well, that should not be happening, but it is. And IQ is one of the strongest determinants of whether a parent will receive a service, but it's certainly not a guarantee that somebody with an IQ of 70 or below will get a service. So there are lots of people, going back to that statement by Public Health, there are lots of people, lots of parents with mild learning disabilities who are not on anyone's radar, usually living in poverty without much support. They can get away by functioning at some level. They often want to disguise that disability, and when it emerges, it's not always recognised by social workers, by children's social workers, for a whole variety of reasons. This leads to problems within court because cognitive assessments will be done late often. And there's also confusion within children's social care about what is a learning difficulty, what is a learning disability. And unless you actually get adult social care and children's social care working together to be able to improve that understanding, it's perpetuated. And even in my interviews, I found it frustrating that social workers in children's social care continue to talk to me about parents with learning difficulties and not understanding the difference. And also, which, you know, as important in the gatekeeping aspect of what services people can then access. There were assumptions that were flying around. Some social workers in adult social care believed that social workers in children's social care believed that parents who had a learning disability would not be able to parent children ever. And in fact, from my interviews with those in children's social care, there's no evidence for that. There are obviously challenges, but there was no general assumption that that was the case. There was also variation even in one local authority about how cases were handled. There was a child protection chair, conference chair, who said, I've had parents in child protection, in pre-proceedings, they've then come out of it, they've gone to child in need plan, and there's been a real effort to work with those parents to get the support in that's needed. And she said that even in the same authority, in other teams, they go straight into issuing proceedings. So the consistency, even at that level, wasn't there. There were also examples of court decisions which seemed to go against assessments which showed that parents actually had changed, and even where children had been removed previously, the experiences of those earlier removals seemed to dominate. And there were stories told to me, so not cases that I actually could evidence. Service configurations differ enormously. There are specialist parenting services, very few, but the ones I came across were far better practice than elsewhere. There used to be people with learning disability expertise based in adult social care, and they are very rare now. And what's happened, and you can see it also happening with mental health, as the adult social care teams have become generic and the people with learning disability experience have been absorbed into the team, gradually that expertise has been lost. And there were many stories from children's social care about how they missed being able to consult with somebody who had that expertise, and how it was often a thing of the past now. As I said, the specialist parenting services stood out. Pre-birth teams were not in all 8 local authorities that I looked at in some depth, but when they were there, it really supported practice with parents. In one local authority, the equivalent of an early intervention team for adults working with an early intervention team for children's really did seem to provide support for parents in a way at that early level which wasn't available elsewhere, but it was unusual. And And I think also, I won't go into it now, practice frameworks in children's social care, such as some of you might have heard of, science of safety and family safeguarding models, did have an impact on how services were delivered. I'm not saying that they necessarily had a positive one, but they did have an impact. I'm going to leave assessments because Sarah's going to deal with that in a far more knowledgeable way than I could ever do. But I would say that the PAMS assessment, which many of you will come across, there was suddenly a letter went round in June, July to say that it was ceasing, and the local authorities who I was were working with went into a complete panic because they knew that courts liked PAMS, or that's what they said, and they thought, oh hell, what are we going to do now that that's going? So there was a sort of lot of concern around that. And as Sarah will tell you, there are alternatives, and a number of the authorities which I worked with are now moving to the alternatives. Adult social care, children's social care. In most local authorities, they're very separate agencies. So we talk about social care, but we've got agencies, they speak different languages, and they're driven by very different legislation, and it is a problem. Social workers in children's social care, in my experience, with some exceptions, and they're usually the ones who've had some adult social care experience, have very hazy expectations of what adult social care can do, can provide. If a parent is known to adult social care, their pathways tend to be very different, and more support will usually be there through the child protection process and through the court process, but not inevitably. A social worker in adult social care put the very different perspectives which she held and her colleagues and children down to this. I think sometimes the challenge is that we're saying perhaps this parent could manage with support, that's adult social care saying it, and children's services may be more reluctant, and rightly so, because they've got their own remit. That is one of the challenge, and that remit being risk. If children's social care are involved, adult social care may, given all the pressures on them, may not prioritise getting involved and might leave it to children's social care. And if they're not involved at an earlier stage, there is very little chance that they will be involved later on. One social worker said, and it just doesn't make any sense to me because we're here for that child and holistically the family, but we can't give those parents what they need individually because our main focus has to be on the child. So really something around if children's social workers could really have a more joined up relationship with adult social care, we would see a difference at every stage in this process. The big generalization, but not without an element of truth. Someone said children's social care view adult social care thresholds as impossibly high, so they don't bother referring, in other words. And adult social care view is that child protection trumps everything else, so we're going to be expected to take a back seat anyway. There were those in adult social care, children's social care, and lawyers who did think that adult social care was failing in their duty to support parenting. But it almost seemed as if you didn't have an example of it happening and you didn't have a history of it happening, it wasn't happening. Those links had to be made, and often it came down to individuals to make those links. Where there was an assessment of a learning disability, once in proceedings, the general consensus was it would be very difficult to involve adult social care that late. So there was this statement, even though the mother was found to have an IQ of 58, which is very low, she wasn't assessed as requiring support. The argument was that she'd managed for over 30 years. Well, she had managed, but she hadn't managed as a parent for over 30 years. So you've got the systemic divide. You've got Department of Health and Social Care, and you've got Department for Education. Department for Education for children, Department for Health and Social Care for adults. And the twain hasn't met. And in fact, hopefully out of this work, we are moving to some discussions opening up. You also have the local authority divide, which reflects the government department divide. And one Kafka's guardian said it was probably the poorest working connection he had ever seen, and that was between adults and children. And one chair, which I found quite astounding, in one of my local authorities said, if you said to me, how would you get hold of adult services? She'd have to Google it on the local authority website. She didn't have any contacts in adult social care. Often they're in different locations. So, you know, reminiscing about with social workers about how it used to be you just walk down the corridor or go over to the next desk and talk to a colleague who might know something. It's much more difficult if you're at either ends of a large authority. They have different recording systems, and they also have different funding and charging streams. So that is a particular difficulty. So what could, I know I'm taking you through this as a gallop, and I hope that some of you will follow up, and I'm very happy to answer questions, but I'm wanting to put the parents who you might see into the context of what is going on, a broader picture of the social care, which either they can or cannot access. There were a couple, the Booths, who developed a model of what good support would be like for parents with learning disabilities. That was developed at the beginning of this century. Is it realistic in 2024, with all the cuts that we have, to think there can be that much support put in to enable some families with learning disabilities to be able to parent their children? Some parents will need very little support, some would need a great deal of support, and I think there's a moral and ethical issue around that, which has often been ignored. There's also a variation, as I've said, in what support might mean. And there is an interesting report by people at University of Bristol who've looked at what is meant by substituted care, which has often been used in court cases, but actually there's no definition of substituted care and where the line is drawn about what will be supported. I mean, generally within our communities, services, early intervention services, voluntary services that might have been there are very few and far between. And there are very few specifically dedicated services for parents with learning disabilities. And parents and children's needs change over time, and how to support and reflect this in any package that is put in. I'm coming back to my good practice guidance. Enormously low awareness of it across all the local authorities I was in. And, you know, as a result, it wasn't being implemented. Not surprisingly, even though you've got those two logos of defunct government departments on the front of it, there's been an absence of any commitment to that guidance. But it was endorsed by both presidents of the family division, firstly in 2018 and then again last year. It appears in a number of court cases, and I still struggle to understand that, given the prominence it has achieved in some cases, why local authorities are not aware of it, and where even the legal teams in local authorities are not encouraging social workers to pay more attention to this. I mean, going back to a case in 2011, and we're now in 2023, Mr. Justice Baker criticised social workers for not being familiar with the guidance. And it goes on through cases right through to last year, to the point where a solicitor said, the guidance as it stands is not worth the paper it's written on. So we've got this big divide between social care understanding, particularly children's social care's understanding, and then engaging with adult social care, and the court's understanding of its use. Very quickly about timelines. We know that they slipped and have slipped, and there is some pressure now to get them back online, but really are those timelines that are in place, do they fit with the work which should be undertaken with parents to give them a chance to see if they can change? What is a realistic time frame? When a barrister I spoke to said that none of her cases where the parents had kept, and this is not learning disabilities cases, none of the parents were in the cases where parents had kept their children had she brought in within 26 weeks. So if we're talking about parents with learning disabilities, where does that leave them? Training for lawyers, I know, has improved, but I think from feedback, there's some way to go. And generally with intermediaries, there were very positive, I think, encounters with intermediaries and the way they were viewed, but there were also a few negatives, particularly where they weren't as well trained or as familiar with courts as judges and barristers would have liked to have seen them. Post-removal support, which was one of the things which I was particularly keen to explore. There's a lot of work being done by colleagues at University of Lancaster about how recurrent parents coming back, having had a child removed, then coming back into court, repeated removals. So, you know, the thrust has been on what could be done to support parents. Well, adult social care probably is not on the scene very much after a child is removed, unless there's been a particular relationship built up with parents. Parents, the few we saw, but also it's written up in other literature, they don't particularly want to have contact with social workers straight after removal because they see the social workers as instrumental in having the child removed. There were a number of lawyers who actually gave accounts of how they had provided support to individuals, but they do not necessarily know where they can refer to or the support the parents might need in an ongoing way. In one authority I looked at, in integrated health and adult social care, because they were experts in this area and where they were involved with the parent, they would continue supporting, but they didn't feel that their expertise was being used more widely across the local authority. I'll just mention very briefly as well PAWS, which I'm not sure you have in your areas, but there are a number of PAWS practices and similar practices across the country who work with parents where children have been removed. In London, to get access to it, I think it is now that you have to have had 3 children removed before you can gain access to PAWS. Those that are based in local authorities that they've developed themselves are slightly easier to access. And I have looked at PAWS to see would they work with parents with learning disabilities. And I think it's a challenge. And I think much of the response I got related to parents with learning difficulties, but actually to introduce that therapeutic support that PAWS offers, it would have to be adapted considerably to work with a number of parents with learning disabilities. And I don't think that we are there yet. I've talked about PAWS. Looking back over it, I mean, so much, I am nearly finished, Deborah, I know my time. So much of the good practice I saw came down to individuals. And that really is not the way we ought to be running services. It shouldn't be dependent on the knowledge, contacts of an individual. It has to be more widely dispersed across authority. Very quickly, what hasn't helped? The disconnect between services, between adults, children's and health. Confusion at an early stage about learning disabilities and learning difficulties, leaving social workers unsure about this. Social workers acting in isolation. I mean, one local authority where I was working and I was having a focus group with social workers in children's social care, and they were joined by a colleague who worked in the learning disabilities team for children, and he brought along a tool that he used to assess parents with learning disabilities who had children with learning disabilities. Maybe it wasn't the right tool, but the fact that nobody there in the room knew about that tool really reflected so many other instances where things were happening there might be an expert in a particular area, but others didn't know about it. There are various good initiatives, such as the multi-agency parenting skills assessment, which you had in Cambridgeshire anyway, which has disappeared. And it really did seem to be moving practice. And if anybody wants to know more about that, contact me. We have guidance, which isn't guidance or really isn't being implemented. We have a lot of research that's been done in the past on good practice, often on initiatives which then don't go on to be funded beyond a certain time period. We have resources that are all put in at the far end to get cases through court. The amount of resources then, which if some of that was front-ended, would make life very different for some parents. And also we have the overall effects of austerity now and scarcity of resources and the general pressures on local authorities. Somebody quoted today on the 1 o'clock news, they were talking about what percentage of a local authority funding went on social care, and it was 88%. And we're still not managing to give people the services that they need. Right, that's me finished. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much. You've given us lots to think about. And I think it was probably about 8 or 9 years ago that we had a webinar. Well, it wasn't a webinar, it was a seminar on MAPSA. So you really have given us a lot to think about what's been happening since. And now can I hand over please to Sarah, and do send in questions if anyone would like to do so, and we can deal with those at the end.
Do I need to stop this to let Sarah?
I think you need to stop your share screen so that Sarah can then share hers. I haven't accidentally, oh no, you're on.
No, I'm on. Okay. All right, good afternoon, everybody. So I'm Sarah Seekins. I'm an independent social worker, having worked in the local areas for quite a few years now. I think it's 9 years since I went as an independent social worker. During that time, I've completed, I think, in excess of about 400 parenting assessments with parents with learning difficulties, so either PAMS or Parent Assess, let alone all the other assessments that I'm instructed to undertake. So I'm hoping today I can just share my knowledge around assessing parents with learning difficulties and the different tools that are used in the assessment process, and just really to consider the differences of the models and how they are used, and showing the comparisons and the complexities with the work that we undertake. So I thought the best thing to probably do is to talk you through. Now, some of you might already know how the assessments are and how we input the data and what we share, but I thought it'd be good to kind of look at the two different assessments that are used currently, and the differences between them. So the two that we have is the PAMS assessment, which as Mary was talking about, said that last year we received an email to say that they were no longer delivering training and it would cease to be trading. So that meant that Parent Assess has kind of overtaken, I suppose, with regards to training, because it's only training that you can undertake now, alongside, I think, Cubus as well, with regards to assessment of parents with learning difficulties. So the PAMS assessment, the Parent Assessment Manual, is an assessment, a practical-based assessment undertaken when a parent or carer has a degree of learning need. So the assessment focuses on the parent's practical capabilities to meet the needs of the child. As I said, it's been around for quite a few years now. What I tried to do was kind of pull off, this is my technology at its best. So I tried to pull off kind of the different stages that takes place during the PAMS assessment. So part of this is quite a structured assessment tool. The first part is working with the parents to look at what they think they need help with. So we complete the I need help form, and they score the form from 0 to 3, and we work through the child's profile and the parent's profile, and they're basically looking at themselves, where they think their knowledge is and what level of support they need in each area. We then go on to do the initial screening tool, and that's undertaken with usually with the social worker, the allocated social worker. And in that, again, it has the same areas as the I need help form, but it's the social worker scoring, so 0 to 3, on how much support or how much concern there is regarding the parent's care of the children. Once you've completed those, you would then go on to work with the parent and undertake a number of sessions and observations with the parent, depending on their level of learning difficulty and how much time is required with them. So you would start with a parent questionnaire, which would go over the parent's history, looking at the genogram for themselves, their family history, the family tree, understanding their experiences. So it talks about how the parent has had their schooling. So did they access any special educational school? Did they were they supported in any way during their childhood? Were they known to social care? Were they looked after children at any point? So it kind of gives us a really good overview of the parent's history. You then have the knowledge cartoons and the parenting booklet. And then these are both undertaken. So the knowledge cartoons are 32 cartoon pictures that are shown to the parent that has a question attached to the knowledge cartoon. They're quite brief. Some parents can do them within an hour. Some parents need a couple of sessions to go through, again, depending on their understanding of them, their processing speed, their ability to be able to take in that information. But they are quite short questions that go with it, and those are then recorded. And then lastly, depending on which way around you want to do it, you've got the parenting booklet that works through the parent's knowledge and skills with regards to parenting. So then that is all fed into the worksheet, the PAMS worksheet. So you can see here you've got the knowledge cartoon, and underneath that you have a score rating, which is what the practitioner completes. Now, the practitioner, the social worker undertaking it, would need to input the answers to the question of the knowledge cartoon, then score that. Then going along, you would then have the parenting booklet, and you would then start putting in all the answers that had been given by the parent on that section. Then you go over to the other side, talking about the actual frequency regarding if the parent is putting into practice what they've said to you, and then you give it an overall scoring at the end. This is 94 pages when you're completing the PAMS. So you flick through 94 of these sheets. Obviously, I didn't put them all on here, but you flick through 94 sheets of these and go through. And not all age ranges are relevant. So you would only input the age range of the child that you're assessing. But it is quite a substantial piece of work, because it's a layered approach to the information you're given. So you're forever inputting the information. So when you've done the knowledge cartoons, you input those as you're going along. You then put the responses from the parenting booklet, and also the responses from the questionnaires that they've completed as well. So that's in a very quick way, just to give you an idea of what's entailed in that. Now, that can take anything from 4 to 6 sessions, and on top of that, you would also have at least 2 observations with that as well, so you can see whether the parent is actually able to put into practice what you have spoken to them about. Then looking at the Parent Assess assessment, so this was developed in 2016 for assessing parents who have learning disabilities and other additional needs within childcare proceedings. It addresses both the emotional and practical aspects of parenting and seeks to identify both the strengths and the concerns. So with the Parent Assess, there are some similarities with it, but what the Parent Assess tend to use is the traffic light system. So you have green for no issue or positive, amber for some concerns, and red for significant concerns. So the Parent Assess uses the strengths and concerns record, which is completed by the parents. So again, you will work through with the parent what they feel, what they rate themselves, either green, amber or red, as to how they are doing in certain tasks with their parenting. You then have the knowledge and confidence book, which is completed with the parent, and the parent will grade their level of confidence and what their knowledge is with regards to parenting. Then you have observations. For older children, you would do a piece of work with the older children to gather their views, and other tools can be used with this. All of this is then put onto, here we go, it's my technology. All of this is then put onto the screening tools, and I've just put one section of it so you can see what we have to do with it. So you would basically go through on the software and score red, amber or green onto each section. There are different sections. You've got child experience, parental functioning, daily living skills, and specific issues which relate to substance misuse, domestic abuse, gambling, offending. And something that the Parent Assess really looks at is the support network around the parents, what the family have in place already, what support they can draw on, and what that looks like for them. So once all of that is inputted, you then end up with this. So on the left-hand side, you've got the PAMS graph that comes out from once you've generated the report. And on the right, you have the outcome table for the Parent Assess. So as you can see with the PAMS, it's often quite confusing with what means what, because you have colours and you have coding and you have numbers. So it's not a very easy read. And I have to be honest, I sometimes take these out of my assessments once they're generated, because it's not only is it very difficult to explain, but actually parents don't understand this part of the assessment, and to have a narrative around it, I find is always far more beneficial than trying to show all these different colours, because sometimes you've got blue and red and green and amber and all sorts going on. Whereas the Parent Assess, it is a bit clearer, because you can quite clearly see what is green, what is positive, what is a slight concern, and where the main concerns do lie. So you do have a clearer picture with regards to the Parent Assess outcome table. So again, so the assessor summary, on the left, you've got the PAMS assessment summary, and I'm sure most of you have probably seen this pie chart that comes up. Again, for a parent to read this, it can be quite challenging, because what you're seeing here is 3, 2, 1 and criterion reached, and it gives you a percentage of that. Whereas the assessor's summary in the Parent Assess, you do have the different areas, and it quite clearly tells you what areas the parent is got strengths in, what areas are some concerns, and what areas are a significant concern. So again, it's just a bit more parent friendly in the sense that you can see quite quickly, and I think professional friendly as well, to be honest. You can see quite quickly what support is needed, and where are the areas of concern. So I think Mary did touch on this as well, really looking at what the good practice is regarding completing assessments. And this is something we always have to keep in mind when completing assessments with parents with learning difficulties. And that's a good practice guide, which has been updated in 2021 and through the Department of Health and the DFES. So the assessment of parents' learning needs and circumstances should inform the support provided and develop parenting skills. So there needs to be clear communication, ensuring parents have understood what they are told. Use the role play, modelling and videoing parent and professional undertaking a task together. And then you're able to discuss that, compare and reflection. And sometimes in my garage, I've got lots of different aids that I take with me. I've got baby baths, I've got baby bottles, especially for pre-birth assessments. If I want to see if a parent can make a bottle, I have learnt though not to leave the baby powder in the garage because it goes rock hard. So I do have quite a bit of expense every time remembering that, and then ended up buying another packet. But it's really good to actually do those practical tasks with the parent, even in that pre-birth stage as well, because what we try and look for within the assessments is what information has been retained, and what level of support they need to continue to do tasks. And like it says here about repeating topics regularly and offering opportunities for frequent practice. So again, you might do a bottle a few times just to see whether they can withhold that information and then continue that going forward. And like I said here, providing and developing personalised props, helping the parents for you to assess the parent and what they're doing, and how they're managing that. We also need to be within the core process as well as RED compliant. We have to make sure that parenting with support, that support plans must be realistic for who we're assessing. And a higher bar cannot be set. So we're not setting up parents to fail by completing this assessment. We actually need to be realistic about that. The parents' needs arising from their disability must be considered. Parents must be able to participate in the assessment, and parents must understand the process. So we must use clear language, no jargon, and be very aware of how fast we're speaking, because very often when I'm meeting with parents, processing and understanding information is one of the barriers. So we need to make sure that we are working at a pace and a speed that the parents can understand and can take in the information. READ also looks at no judicial barriers, so slow the process down if necessary, and ensuring that there's advocacy in place. I've only got a few minutes with you, so what I've tried to do is kind of to condense it as much as possible. But some of the strengths of the undertaking the parent assessment is can be used for any parent. The tools and the questions are quite interchangeable, and I actually still use some of the tools and the booklets from the PAMS assessment as well, because the pictures, depending on the parent that I'm working with and what they see as most helpful to them, it doesn't mean I can't use those resources. It just means that they're quite interchangeable with that. The parent assess reports are easier to read for parents and professionals. Part of the parent assess is that you provide a separate report to parents. That means that it's in bullet point form, so that they're very clear and understand what recommendations you've made. So instead of having to go through the full report straight away, they can do that later with their solicitor or with the social worker, but they have a shorter report that gives them the information in a clear and concise manner. The other thing is that the observations of time spent with the child are just as important as the one-to-one knowledge gathering. So with regards to parent assess, there's a great emphasis on looking at the attachment of the parent and the child, looking at those nuances that you see within the relationships within those contact sessions, and really taking on board what you see in those observations. Within parent assess as well, you also have a consent form where you could ask the parent if you could do a short video within the contact sessions so that you can go back and review, and also look at that with the parent, especially if there is concerns regarding how they're engaging with one another and what that looks like, so you can actually show the parent what is happening. There is a flexibility of video calls and face-to-face session when gathering information, but that is very, very dependent on the parent's ability to engage with that. Some younger parents that I've worked with find video calls easier to be able to work with me. I get more information when they don't have to sit in a room with me or face me. But lots of parents actually prefer face-to-face. I have some parents, one recently, who would beg me to do a phone call or a video call with them, but actually couldn't stand face-to-face or video calls. It was just, they would become quite abusive in both. So it didn't make a difference really. But there is a flexibility there. And I think we need to be led by how we can gather the information and make the parent feel comfortable in giving that information as well. The parent assess also gives a greater emphasis on what a parent can do rather than what they cannot. So you're focusing on strengths, you're focusing on how they are parenting their child, not just with regards to the risks and concerns that you know about, but also with regards to what they can do, what are the positives. And with all of this, within all the assessments we do, we have to remember that to bring it back to the assessment of framework for children and families in need. So that still needs to be very much part of the assessment process within either PAMS or Parent Assess. Just looking at the challenges really when undertaking assessments with parents with learning difficulties. One of the things is understanding the parents' difficulties, and that's not just with regards to the learning difficulty that may be present for them, but it's also the multi-layered complexities of their life history. They may have suffered trauma, they may have mental health issues alongside their parent learning difficulties. So you have this comorbidity of difficulties that a parent is often facing, and actually sometimes we can focus on one thing and not necessarily see how everything else impacts. So sometimes it's not just about the learning difficulties that's causing the problem for the parent, it's a whole multitude of different areas that can cause difficulties. Some of the challenges that I find as an independent social worker when I'm instructed through the courts is cognitive assessments coming in after I'm asked to start an assessment. So with regards to Parent Assess and PAMS, cognitive assessments are a key document for any social worker undertaking these assessments, because what the cognitive assessment does is help us to understand what level of intervention you can put in place with this parent, what their ability is to process information, to retain information. That has an impact on how long your sessions are, how many sessions will be offered, how many observations you will undertake. So very often I'm asked for, can I have a schedule for appointments? And that's absolutely fine. But actually I need to see the bundle of documents first. I need to see that cognitive assessment first in order to determine how much time is going to need to be spent on what areas. During the Parent Assess training, you are trained to look at cognitive assessments and try and understand them, because they're not always the most easy to read, especially if you're new to these assessments. But the processing of information, retaining information, is really important for the practitioner to understand, so that you can be working at the parent's pace and get the best information out of from them during the assessment. Also the supporting documents, and making sure there's that triangulation of work between different practitioners, so making sure connecting with health, making sure connecting with schools, education provisions, and just making sure as part of the assessment you're able to do that. And that can be challenging to either get those reports or get those information, especially as an independent worker. So it does take quite a bit of effort and time with that. The other challenge is contact records and recording of those contacts. The difficulties that are faced is that you can read contact records that will say lovely interaction, this was happening, they came in, they were warm and welcoming. Sometimes it doesn't actually reflect, like I said earlier, about the nuances of the interactions and attachments between the parent and the child, which is why observation of contact is really important. So whilst I will always review the contact records and ask for that bundle as part of my assessment, I am also mindful that my observations during that assessment is also very important, and we recommend at least 2 observations of contact. Sometimes that's not possible, sometimes we can't do that for a number of reasons, but that would be best practice of looking at that. Chasing key information, this really comes back to, as an independent social worker, trying to get started on reports, especially when we've got quite tight deadlines, and just making sure that information is given to the workers as quickly as possible, such as names, addresses, telephone numbers, contact sessions. It just lessens that time of trying to get these assessments started, and it's often helpful to have all that information in letter of instructions and to help us to get out there as soon as possible, really. The challenge of lack of engagement of parents, and we can't force parents to do anything if they don't want to do it. I do spend a lot of time with parents with learning difficulties who do find it difficult to engage. They don't always understand what's being asked of them. They very much see me very often as just another social worker coming in. They don't often understand that I'm independent and I don't work for the local authority. So that lack of engagement can really hinder timescales for these assessments, because you can't undertake these assessments without having that one-to-one time with the parents. And very often I can be asked, well, can you just give a view? And I can, but I also make it very clear that it's based on what I've read. It's not based on my interactions with the parent or any assessment that I've managed to do of them because of that lack of engagement. Another challenge is RED compliant versus a court deadline. Depending on how quickly assessments need to be completed, what the court timescales are. And I know that as Mary was saying, there's a pull to get back to that 26-week as quickly as we can. However, the difficulty is that when we're working with parents with learning difficulties, sometimes it's longer than 8 to 12 weeks to complete assessments. Sometimes it needs 16 weeks, just depending on their level of, like I said, ability to process information, retain that information, and to give them a fair assessment. Some families and parents can whiz through the assessment really quickly and manage it, but some can't, and that there is a conflict there about us being RED compliant and the court deadline. There are some challenges with the hours allocated to the assessment, which is out of our hands. I know some people request more hours to complete the assessments. Sometimes you can work within the legal aid assessment timeframes for that, and sometimes you can't, and additional time is requested. And again, that goes down to what the parent needs with regards to completing a fair assessment. And resources for support needed. So there are sometimes recommendations that are made. I will do research for local areas, but the support is not there. And I think Mary touched on that quite a lot, that actually when you're looking at resources for adults with learning difficulties, parents with learning difficulties, it can be somewhat sparse depending on what local authority you're working for. So you can put in there in your report about certain support that's needed, but it won't necessarily always be able to be given, and that's a real shame with regards to if you do identify support that can be put in place. And the other side is about part assessments or a midway report. And I wanted to put this in because with PAMS it's really difficult to do a midway report. It's far much easier with Parent Assess, because you can give a view at that point, because you can see what's happening. But with the PAMS report, until you've inputted all the data into those 94 pages and generated the report, it's very difficult to then pull off that information. And you could say, oh, well, it's going to be this sections, but actually once you've inputted it, you could have other areas that are coming up which you hadn't exactly picked up on at that point. So what you don't want to do is give information that's, not that it's not accurate, but more that it's not as accurate as it could be. So yeah, so that is kind of a whistle-stop tour of the two different assessments. I'm using more PAMS assessments now rather than Parent Assess. No, I'm using Parent Assess rather than PAMS, sorry. We're being less requested for PAMS assessments, as I said, because the new standard seems to be the Parent Assess. I find it personally a lovely assessment tool to use, but like I said, I still dip into my resources from PAMS because they can be used really easily as well. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. That's a really helpful introduction to the Parent Assess model, which isn't yet that well known in this area, although, as you say, used increasingly often. And it's very useful to have those practical suggestions at the end, and stressing how important it is to have the cognitive assessment first. And I don't think we have any questions. So if I can just ask Judge Gonsay to speak to us now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody. What I was hoping for, but maybe it's too difficult for Sarah to put it back on, is if that list of challenges could be back on the screen. Is that possible? But while you're trying to do that, let me say, first of all, thank you very much to Deborah once again for arranging this webinar and bringing together for us two really interesting speakers. And my thanks very much to Mary and to Sarah for providing their presentations and their talks to us. The reason I thought it would be helpful to have that challenges list back on the screen is it does show us how much these two areas are linked, because all of us who do this work know how difficult it is if the parents get a report that says how much they need to do, and then it transpires that a lot of the help and support they would need should probably come, if they have learning disabilities, from adult social care. And of course, if adult social care were involved with them at an early stage, pre-birth, for example, one might be able to get cognitive assessments earlier. They might be able to have a better help and support to make sure they comply with the requirements of them. They would probably get more help and support to engage in the process. And very sadly, it's quite clear from what we've heard and what we all know ourselves, there isn't enough support for people with learning disabilities. And I think Mary's research, when it's published, is going to be really helpful. And hopefully it can be used by all of us to encourage local authorities to provide more support for parents with learning disabilities, because they often do slip through the net if they need help from adult social care. Because, of course, as we know, children's social care is not there for the parents. It is there for the children. I have to say on the assessment front that I agree with Sarah. I think the parent assess model is much more helpful. Sometimes those the PAMS report at the end with the colour charts and the list of scoring, I think is very difficult for parents to understand, whereas parent assess, I think it's clearer for them. It also does focus on positives as well. And if you can give them a list of the areas they're doing well and then the areas that they need to work on, I think it's a big help. So personally, I like the move across to parent assess. And to everybody here, all I can say to all of you is if you have clients who have learning disabilities and you think they need help and support, push on their behalf for adult social care to get involved. And when we get Mary's research, let's push it to local authorities to really make them take on board getting their services better integrated so that we can provide parents with the help and support they need. But from all of us, I really just want to thank both of you very much because I thought they were very helpful and informative presentations.
Well, thank you very much, everyone, for coming. Thank you to our panelists. And for those of you who joined late, I did explain at the beginning that we will be sending out the recording and the PowerPoint presentations as usual, but there'll be a slight delay just to allow Mary to formally complete her research and submit it. So we're probably looking at early springtime, but they will be out in due course. And of course, you can share with colleagues too. Thanks very much. I'm just going to stop the recording now.